Good evening, everyone. My name is Gauri Viswanathan, and on behalf of the South Asia Institute, I'm pleased to welcome you to a panel discussion on the scrapping of Article 370 and 35A and its effects on the future of Kashmir and the lives of its people. Last month, on August 5th, the BJP-led government introduced a resolution rescinding the constitutional safeguards that for nearly 70 years preserved Jammu and Kashmir's special status, whereby the state had its own constitution and the power of parliament to impose laws was restricted unless the state government concurred. In one stroke, without prior consultations, the government scaled down Kashmir and divided the state into two union territories, using Article 370 itself to rationalize the repeal of existing provisions. In addition, revoking Article 35A had profound implications for the demography of the state, in that it now permitted Indian citizens to buy property in Kashmir, reversing the restriction of ownership of properties in the state to Kashmiri residents. The modifications of Kashmir's demography are not the least of the seismic changes set in motion by the decision to revoke Articles 370 and 35A. The reimagining of Kashmir as an investment and tourist destination, amenable to Indian business interests and economic objectives, follows a para-colonial logic in its insistence that economic development had stalled for 70 years and now required active intervention by the Indian state. In a preemptive move, the government shut down communication lines in Kashmir, suspending telephone, mobile phone, and internet services, and drastically restricted movements of peoples. Numerous individuals and state leaders were arrested or put under house arrest, ostensibly to prevent outbreaks of violence. The curbs on journalists reporting from Kashmir have virtually isolated the state from the rest of India and the world, creating an information vacuum. The suspension of information from and about Kashmir that is not filtered through government agencies has made it all the more difficult to assess the realities on the ground. The need to recover narratives that are not part of the official discourse has never been greater, as is the urgency of giving voice to the people whose lives are most directly impacted by the abrogation of Articles 370 and 35A. The South Asia Institute's aim in organizing this event is to provide a forum for informed discussion about the history of the circumstances that put in place Kashmir's special status provisions, as well as to analyze how the rescinding of Articles 370 and 35A reconfigures Kashmir in accord with the current government's stated objectives. Our distinguished speakers, whom we are very privileged to have here, hope to provide much-needed historical context and analysis, combined with perspectives on the impact of Article 370's revocation on the lives of the people. Suchitra is a barrister at law, writer, and a photographer, working across research, human rights, and visual storytelling. She is the founder and executive director of the Polis project, a New York-based hybrid research and journalism organization that studies critical human rights and political issues. As an attorney, she previously worked for the United Nations War Crimes Tribunal for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. She co-founded and was the legal director of the Resettlement Legal Aid Project in Cairo, that gives legal aid for Iraqi refugees. As a graduate student at Yale, she researched and documented stories along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. Her book, Midnight's Border, is forthcoming. So please welcome Suchitra.
Can everyone hear me? It's great. Today is day 52 of the Kashmir siege, so I just kind of wanted to start with that note. A very long time ago, Edward Said talked about Palestine, and he said Palestine is an extraordinary place. And when he said Palestine, and when he said that Palestine was an extraordinary place, I think what he was actually trying to say, and that's true of Kashmir as well, is that we are constantly trying to establish fact and history against number of people's opinion, misinformation, disinformation. And there's this deep sense of constantly fighting to establish fact. And I've spoken about Kashmir in a few panels in the last few years. And today is incredibly hard because how many things does one address in 20 minutes when over 8 million people have been silently, violently silenced and held under a siege? So then what does one do? One goes back to the greats that you follow and you go with the personal as the political. The photograph you would see here, or rather the video clip, I was wondering if anybody can tell me what this is if you saw it. I just want one answer. If anyone could kind of tell me what they think this is or what this represents. No, it's okay. Okay, but the real story is that is how I was able to talk to a dear friend and editor-in-chief of the Polis project, who's right now in Kashmir, in Srinagar. And I couldn't get in touch with him till day 35. If somebody could play it, and then I could kind of use that clip and give you the context, and then we would go on to talk about how we can think and write and talk about occupation as a social, political, and a spatial existence.
And just be safe, man. Just be safe. And so just come out of the other side safe, and that's all. Yeah.
So my friend and dear friend and photographer Ritesh Uttam Chandani sent this clip to me. And he also wrote something of his experience. So what you've actually witnessed here is how people and civilians around South Asia are connecting Kashmiris to their friends and family. What you really see here is me on the phone, on Facebook Messenger, talking to my friend. And we are both on speaker. And Ritesh, who finally, after 30 days of calling this number, gets through to Nawaz, and Nawaz is on speaker. And the way we communicate is by placing these two phones together. And this is something that Ritesh sent me. The reason why we had problems with this clip is that this is something that Ritesh sent me. And again, Ritesh has witnessed hundreds of civilians around India doing this, who have literally become telephone exchange nodes and facilities. And again, Ritesh is someone, the reason I'm kind of putting all of this in context is that all of us have friends. I don't have family, but I have friends. And we all have been talking to everybody else. Everybody has everybody's number. We are all trying to go and reach out and make sure everybody's fine. So Ritesh has already been doing this. He's already sent people to look for my friend. He says, and this is Ritesh writing to me, I gave it a go and I tried the 1942 number. It was 11 p.m. I think. Miraculously, it went through. And this was day 35 of the siege. It was answered by N himself. This was the first time we had spoken. He sounded tired or sleepy, and I felt a little bad for having disturbed him. But I was happy I got through, and I was sure his colleagues will feel the same. What do you talk about though? Is everything okay? Do you need anything? Etc., etc. The answers to most of such questions is a no. My battery was low, but we managed an awkward conversation. I mentioned to him to stay up for a while, so I can go up 10 floors and speak to Suchitra, his colleague in New York. I prayed that the lines stay open till he got home. On the window ledge of my room, my old iPhone called Suchitra via FB, Facebook Messenger, and my sister's Samsung dialed Nawaz. At one point, my curious sister and I stood at the door and simply looked in the direction of the two phones. When we were growing up, we didn't have a phone. The wealthier amongst us would celebrate the arrival of a phone. I'm just cutting out things in the middle. The family album of every Indian child born in the 80s will probably have one photo of a family member posing next to or with a dialer phone. It is bizarre that while the rest of the country can swipe away at will, Kashmiris are ambushed back in time and have no option but to rely on these domestic telephone exchanges. Most of the time, to simply say to their children that everything is okay. And this is an incredibly powerful testimony of someone just watching what's happening. And why do we start with this? Not only to talk about this as a humanitarian crisis, because often we can talk about humanitarian crisis and human rights violations without actually talking about whether Kashmiris have been given the freedom that they've always demanded. The freedom to decide for themselves how they should rule themselves, who should rule themselves, who should rule them, how they should constitute themselves, and what the future for them means. No one has given them that right. And if you speak to most Kashmiris, they will tell you that they have been fighting an occupying army since the Mughals first marched in. But second is also to talk about the immense violence of silencing over 8 million Kashmiris for over 52 days. And what does that mean for a constitutional republic that we call India? And again, adds up, I am still an Indian citizen, and in some ways, I think it is, and someone who has worked as a lawyer, who continues to do research, to produce scholarship. I also want to foreground the idea that it is only in times like this that our scholarship truly matters. Because what is the function of knowledge if that knowledge is not put in service of speaking for? Again, I don't claim to speak for Kashmiris, I only stand in solidarity with them to think and write and speak about their right to ask for the freedom that they choose. Now, when I said, one of the reasons I wanted to start with Ritesh and this phone is also to think about the violence silencing of people in terms of occupation. What is occupation? In some ways, occupation is not only occupying the space, it's also occupying your mind. And in some ways, occupation of Kashmir is legal, it's social, and it's spatial. And I think that is something that we all have to understand in a much larger historical position. I'm sure Hafsa can speak more about the historical continuities of it. And one of the things that we also have to understand is that this is not the first time that Kashmiris have been placed under a curfew. If you remember, soon after Burhan Wani's death, Kashmiris were under almost 100 days of continuous curfew. And it's also not the first time that they have faced terror. Let's also understand that the history of terror and violence in the Kashmir Valley is long. Some might say it's the 1990s, but some would also take it as back as the 1930s, where people were already resisting and protesting. And in some ways, I think it's absolutely important for us to foreground and bring back these histories of resistance. But the most important thing of all, I think, and I think while I can stand in solidarity with the Kashmiris as an ally, what I am eminently qualified to do is to speak about my own country and its own constitutional exercises of what it does in the place it occupies. Now, what does this mean for India? And what does it mean for dismantling of India as a constitutional republic? And I think again, let's not forget that this is not just the BJP government. The dismantling of India as a constitutional republic is a much longer process. It started with the Congress. It started with multiple instances where India's highest apex courts have actually failed to interpret the law. We talk about basic structure, but one of the fundamental ideas of the fundamental rights is that the courts always interpret the fundamental rights in favor of the citizen and not the state. That is fundamental, and in some ways the most revolutionary thing that one can think about the Indian Republic as a constitutional republic. But it's been a very long time since one could actually think of the Indian Supreme Court's apex courts, and many of its courts, as actually interpreting the laws in favor of the citizen and not the state. We've seen this happen multiple times throughout the history. But what is the difference now? I think what we've really seen is the weaponization of the Indian Constitution, its courts, and its people to target dissent, to target criminalization. And this, again, was perfected in places like Punjab, in places like Kashmir, for a really long time. Often what we forget to place is that within a constitutional history, often one of the things that became very famous in the last few years was the idea of constitutional morality. What do we think about constitutional morality when we talk about our systems, our books, our rights, and our laws are consistently breached? Not only by the men and women who are supposed to be its guards, but also men and women who consistently eroded through constitutional methods to absolute disregard of systems, disregard for systems, and how we consistently think about this. And Article 370, and many Kashmiri scholars have spoken about this, is that Article 370 has been hollowed out, in many cases unconstitutionally and illegally for the last 70 odd years. And this is simply the last hammer to what one thinks about as, in some ways, the autonomous status of Kashmir. And another thing I hope we can discuss is also to think about what can we do to change the language and narrative of rights within India. We have to think about democracy in different ways. We have to radically reimagine what the future means for us. And that also includes standing up and questioning, but also standing up for spaces of dissent, to standing up to create places of dissent. I know I'm going to keep it really short, and a couple of things I do want to talk about, but I feel like I'm running out of time, is kind of throw out scholars and writers I would really want you to look up. One of the remarkable things about Kashmir is that it has produced some remarkable female scholars, writers, thinkers, and journalists. Mona Ban, Hafsa Kanjwal, Atar Zia, Junaid, and there's a generation of young scholars who have produced work, academic scholarship that is absolutely important for us to engage with. And the reason I'm putting this out is also for us to read, become familiar with these things, but also for us to start understanding how we have to reimagine India. A big part of this moment of dissent and resistance is not only a dissent and resistance to what the Indian state has done in Kashmir through 370, it is also for us to radically reimagine what India means. And that radical reimagination of India, as far as I can see now, is very vacuous. And I hope these are things that we can think about, talk about. And I think I will hand on the, I think I'll rest now.
Our third speaker is Hafsa Kanjwal, who is an assistant professor of South Asian history at Lafayette College. She received her PhD in history and women's studies from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Her research focuses on post-partition state building in Kashmir. She has written and spoken on Kashmir for a variety of news outlets, including the Washington Post, Al Jazeera English, and the BBC. So Hafsa, very warm welcome to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me and to all of you for being here. I do want to start off by saying that while I'm happy that we are having this conversation on Kashmir, broadly speaking, amongst our South Asia centers, institutes, and the academy, it should not have taken the events of August 5th as well as the potential of an impending settler colonial project under the ruling fascist government in India for us to realize the urgency of having sustained conversations on Kashmir. What I have to say might make some uncomfortable, but I want to fundamentally lay out what is at stake here, and I believe this moment merits it. I believe it is imperative that we change the basic frameworks and categories that have set up the debate on Kashmir thus far. As a Kashmir scholar, it has been frustrating to see the ways in which honest and empirically grounded conversations on Kashmir rarely make it into our academic spaces, especially conversations that move beyond the India-Pakistan framework and privilege Kashmiri voices, aspirations, and perspectives. Indeed, the violence on Kashmir is epistemological as it is physical, and there is a reinforcing relationship between the two. There's a complicity, largely on the part of many Indian, liberal, and leftist academics, as well as some of their Pakistani counterparts, in their invocations of the complexity or the complicated nature of Kashmir. On a personal level, I cannot begin to count the number of times I have asked senior academics why they do not engage with the question of Kashmir in their work on the Indian state, subaltern studies, post-colonial studies, partition studies, feminist studies, and so on. I recall the JNU row some years ago when academics around the globe mobilized and expressed their solidarity with the JNU students who were being charged with sedition. In a moment that perfectly captured the contradictions inherent in the liberal project, the only voices worth standing in solidarity with were those of the JNU students, but not the millions in Kashmir whose voices and aspirations have been muzzled for over 70 years, and who were the main reason why the JNU row occurred in the first place. It must be said, this blind spot is simultaneously rooted in a deep-seated allegiance to the idea of an Indian nation, as well as a more sophisticated form of Islamophobia, which not only continuously constructs the bogey of Pakistan, erasing any form of Kashmiri agency, but also engages in a majoritarian impulse of being completely unable to apprehend and thereby dismiss Muslim political aspirations. Let's be frank, Kashmir is complicated because it is a Muslim majority space, and many liberals and leftists alike cannot bear to contend with that reality. What is ironic, then, is that the differentiation between many of the Indian secular or liberal intelligentsia and proponents of Hindu nationalism, especially on the question of Islam or Kashmir, is not so variegated. It relies on the same tropes, the same processes of othering, and the same inability to see beyond a nationalist impulse. As the scholar Noshin Ali has argued, and I quote, "The racist, casteist, and irredentist fabric of Indian society is invisible in a secular on top, Savarna underneath national discourse in which Muslims are the problem populace and Kashmir to be subdued at all cost," end quote. While things may start to change, especially given the challenges that the Hindutva project poses to this idea of India as a pluralistic democratic space, I feel that there still remains a romanticism about India before Modi, or even before Hindutva began to gain traction in the past few decades. Fundamentally, the Kashmir question today and the revocation of Article 370 is not about India's democratic or liberal institutions being undermined or under threat. It is, however, a culmination of India's long-standing colonial occupation in Kashmir, one that has taken various forms over the past 72 years. If, as Kashmir studies scholar Goldi Asuri argues, that, quote, "the first phase of this occupation was the contested accession to India. The second phase was the immense militarization of the region, which remains the most militarized in the world, and bringing in laws that give the Indian Army complete impunity for their actions in Kashmir. Then this third phase will be marked by a full-on settler colonial project." To be sure, aside from the families associated with the various client regimes of the Indian government, Kashmir's Muslim majority did not maintain any allegiance to or nostalgia surrounding Article 370. Kashmir's special status, enshrined in the article, was built on the understanding between the Indian leadership as well as its client state in Kashmir that integration to India would be a hard sell for the vast majority of Kashmiris after partition. Over time, the article remained one on paper. Kashmiris, and here I use the word Kashmiri as a political identity, not solely an ethnic identity, know that the autonomy that had been promised to them had eroded over time as the Indian state entered into all aspects of political, economic, legal, and civic life in Kashmir, well beyond the communications, foreign affairs, and defense, which is what its domain had been officially restricted to. The legality or illegality of the revocation, then, is not the primary framework from which Kashmiris see these developments. They know all too well how the law in Kashmir has served as a critical component of the military occupation through acts like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which provides complete impunity to the armed forces in Kashmir, and the Public Safety Act, what Amnesty International has referred to as a lawless law, as it allows the preventive detention of people, including children, against whom there is no criminal offense. Why there is rage, however, is related to another article of the Indian Constitution, Article 35A. This article gave the local Kashmiri state the right to define requirements for permanent residency in the state. Permanent residents were able to buy property or buy land. This was a condition that the pro-accession local leadership insisted upon to protect Kashmir's Muslim majority status, and was the last thing Kashmiris were holding on to preserve some semblance of their nationhood. But this has now changed. Indians can now buy property and land in Kashmir and drive out the indigenous population. Thus, what is at stake in this move is the beginnings of a settler colonial project in Kashmir. To be sure, the land was already populated by the Indian Army, over 700,000 strong, who had taken over large swaths of land with their cantonments, camps, and bunkers. But now the ruling party had set into motion its long-term plan to populate the region with enough Hindu settlements to make the current Muslim majority's political aspirations for freedom obsolete. The intent here is to change the demographics of Kashmir from a Muslim majority state to one that has a Hindu majority. This process could entail ethnic cleansing. This is why, for Kashmiris, this is an existential moment, one of life and death. One also cannot help but wonder why the fear of democratic institutions being undermined has been a rallying cry for those who protest the abrogation. For Kashmiris, India has never been a democracy. It was not a democracy when the early Indian leadership, including Prime Minister Nehru, suppressed the demand for a UN-backed plebiscite, installing a series of client regimes that were tasked with securing the contested accession for India. It was certainly not a democracy when throughout the 1950s and the 1970s, these client regimes began to repress pro-plebiscite or pro-Pakistan movements in the state, invoking colonial-era draconian laws to prohibit association and speech. Popular forms of dissent were framed as anti-national, seditious, and subversive. Excuse me. It was not a democracy when Congress-led governments rigged elections in Kashmir in the late 1980s, eventually leading to the armed rebellion. And it is certainly not a democracy today, as we mark over 50 days of over 8 million people who are held under siege, where there's a communication blockade, and Kashmiris, including children as young as 11, are being detained and tortured. The tragedy of Kashmir is not a reflection of the lack or erosion of Indian democracy. It is a product precisely of the sham of Indian democracy, its irresolvable contradictions, violent majoritarianism, and pernicious secularity that thrives on quashing minority lives in the name of liberal pluralism. Any perspective that valorizes the territorial frame of the Indian nation state insidiously suffocates the possibility of alternative political futures and horizons unimprisoned to the idea of India. It is precisely such an absence of political imagination that nourishes the tendency to view Indian atrocities in Kashmir primarily through the prism of the threat that they pose to other Indian states and populations, as a whole host of analysis did after August 4th. In this slippery slope argument, the critique of the Indian state is invariably couched in the language and imperative of saving Indian democracy from itself, or preventing other parts of India from becoming Kashmir. Note the way that this framing both instrumentalizes Kashmir in the service of rescuing India from its own majoritarian pitfalls, but also shackles Kashmir to the project of improving Indian democracy. I repeat, Kashmir has never been a part of India. Its people never gave consent to India's rule over them. It is not a laboratory of Indian democracy, and it is not a litmus test of India's alleged promise of secular equality. The vast majority of Kashmiris desire and demand complete freedom from the territory, idea, and promise of India in all of its manifestations and apparitions. To also pose the question of Kashmir as one that is an issue of Indian federalism, meaning that if only the center could figure out the appropriate degree of control it wants to hold over the various states, is also misguided. Consider the perspective of one scholar who recently was quoted in the BBC, and I quote, "The single biggest significance of this move is that we are moving towards a unitary state and abrogation of democratic principles. This is weakening federalism in India. People are so busy celebrating the move that they don't seem to get the big picture," end quote. This position simply reiterates the Indian state's talking points that the question of Kashmir is one of governance and not sovereignty. One cannot engage with the question of Kashmir without also acknowledging that Kashmir had a historic, popular, anti-feudal, and anti-monarchical struggle for sovereignty well before 1947. The claims and longer histories of the people of this region who existed before India and Pakistan emerged as post-colonial nation-states have been ignored. Kashmir is not like other regions of India because no other region in India has numerous UN resolutions that stake claim to its disputed status under international law. The provisional status of Kashmir's contested accession to India marks it as a different case altogether from other regions. I want to briefly turn to another source of liberal and left anxiety about Kashmir, Islam. it's hard to escape the fact that liberal and left anxieties about Kashmir have to do with Islam, and this has predated the war on terror, that it is anti-secular, that it is violent, and that it is uniquely misogynist. All of these are harnessed and deployed against the Kashmiri struggle, and they work to undermine any kind of nuanced discussion, leave alone solidarity with the Kashmir movement. That is not to say that the war on terror has been crucial in shifting the ground. Undoubtedly, the Indian state has perniciously used the war on terror logic to undermine the movement for self-determination. As Zunaira Kumal notes, those, quote, Kashmiris engaged in jihad against the state's occupation have had their Islamic framework of physical and moral struggle labeled and collapsed under the global phantasm of terrorism, a tactic that is strategically deployed by the global war on terror beneficiaries to disenfranchise Islamic anti-colonial movements, end quote. What we need to understand is the ways in which Islam is simultaneously spectacularized and erased within the logic of the war on terror. Kamal continues that, quote, taking seriously the moral universe being espoused in such aspirations would necessitate a nuanced hermeneutic sensitive to the moral discourse of Islam, which challenges the very notion of secular freedom itself, end quote. Finally, I believe that we, as scholars, students, and concerned individuals, must take an ethical position on the question of Kashmir, one that engages with this oft-repeated refrain of what Kashmiris really want. I want to stress that ending the Indian occupation and giving Kashmiris a right to self-determination is truly the only ethical position one can take on Kashmir. Understandings that simply focus on improving governance, reinstating Article 370, or addressing the human rights violations fail to get to the root of what is at stake. Any solution must, of course, take into consideration the aspirations of all regions and communities of the former princely state. Here, I think it's important to note, as the anthropologist Mona Ban has argued, that the state of Jammu and Kashmir's diversity, be it religious, linguistic, and ethnic, is held up as evidence of the intractable nature of the political divides in the state. It is only the Kashmiri-speaking Sunni Muslims of the Kashmir Valley who demand azadi, the argument goes. What about everyone else? Barn argues that this difference from Kashmiri Muslims is used to frame the Kashmiri struggle for self-determination as parochial and territorially limited in order to render it morally and politically illegitimate. She asks whether those who speak on behalf of these communities, quote, know what it means to live on the border, on the state's margins, to be asked to offer their lives, land, and resources to maintain India's security and territoriality, end quote. Furthermore, as the editors of Resisting Occupation in Kashmir argue, quote, the diversity of the state has been heavily politicized through selective patronage and regional biases in development and governance mechanisms, a policy that local governments have actively pursued to fragment communities in order to stall Kashmir's political resolution and perfect the colonial strategy of divide and rule, end quote. Therefore, foregrounding and resolving Kashmir enables us to think of aspirational futures of the Indian subcontinent beyond the India versus Pakistan binary and beyond Hindu-Muslim divides. Perhaps it will allow us to foresee a future for South Asia beyond the nation-state paradigm. Azadi for Kashmir will mean Azadi for Pakistan, for India, and for the region as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hafsa. Our final speaker really needs no introduction. Partha Chatterjee, our most distinguished political theorist and historian. He is the author of more than 20 books, monographs, and edited volumes, and books and essays that have been enormously influential for many of us working on South Asia studies. Partha is a founding member of the Subaltern Studies Collective, I think as you all know. He divides his time between Columbia and the Center for Studies in Social Sciences in Calcutta, where he was the director from 1997 to 2007. So Partha, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. In case you didn't know, I think by now it should be very clear that as far as Kashmir is concerned, there is no purely objective or neutral position. As we've already heard, in fact, we heard yesterday pronounced very loudly at Houston that Article 370 and Kashmir's special status was a constitutional mistake, which should never have been allowed, and it's only the right thing to do. And it is this government which, after 70 years, has finally done the right thing. So that's a view which, unfortunately, is widely shared in India at this moment. Anybody who is keeping track of what's going on there would know that certainly in the public domain, except for one or two opposition political leaders, there's virtually no organized protest at what happened. So that's one very dominant view. On the other hand, since August 5th, I've heard several of my Kashmiri friends, and Hafsa just repeated that position, which says that Kashmir has been an Indian colony from 1947, and really nothing significantly new happened. This is simply the same story continuing, perhaps because the final nail in the coffin, as somebody mentioned. And yet, those two positions, and then there is a third position, which is coming from some, I would say still very few scholars, academics, a few journalists, lawyers, and you see them mostly as op-ed pieces in major newspapers, which point to precisely the what is significantly new and what is alarmingly new about this particular event. Between them, what I would like to say that these are not positions that can be fitted together. But more than that, these political positions are not necessarily positions that are open to anyone to choose. These are not necessarily ethical choices. There are certain kinds of political positions that one has to negotiate because that is the position where one is. Both Suchitra and Hafsa have explained the way in which, from 1947 onwards, all the way to last month, the occupation of Kashmir, its military occupation, its political subjugation, essentially, has occurred over the years through legal, semi-constitutional, and sometimes by very large measure, sheer military force. But there is something still to be said about the argument that is being made. I mean, the important question to face is, why is this argument that Article 370 should never have been there, this exceptional article, should rightly be removed from the Constitution, at least from having any constitutional effect? Why does that argument have such enormous purchase? I think it's important to understand this. But I think a lot of people have completely forgotten the actual history of why Article 370 came to be there. It's an interesting history, and some of you know I love to tell stories, so this will give me a good opportunity to tell a few stories about why Article 370 came to be there. It's often not remembered that when partition took place in 1947, around the time of the transfer of power, many princes, the so-called native princes, many princes did not want to join either India or Pakistan. They were thinking of the option of an independent status, and including especially the Nawab of Bhopal, who was then the president of, it was called the president of the Chamber of Princes. That was the upper house of the federal legislature at the time in 1946, who even toyed with the idea of a union of all the princes as a separate dominion. Now, Mountbatten, as viceroy, completely ruled out this possibility. In June, there was a famous speech in June, he addressed the Chamber of Princes and said that is an option which the British government will not recognize. British government will not recognize more than 2 dominions. So every prince will have to choose between these 2 dominions. And that was the framework. And in order to make it possible for the princes to join, there were 2 things that were done. One, to restrict the merger, what was called the accession, to 3 topics, 3 subjects only: defense, foreign affairs, and communications. These were the 3 subjects on which the Union government was allowed to make rules for those states. Otherwise, everything else, it would depend on the consent of the state to decide whether or not a central law would be applicable to that state. That was the framework of the instrument of accession for every state, and there were some 560-something states at the time. So over a period of negotiation and so on, there were several princes who were not very happy with this, but finally they were allowed. And of course, the compensation for this was what was known as the privy purse, which was an annual pension which was assigned to each prince as sort of compensation for giving up their sovereign position. Now, the interesting thing was this instrument of accession was signed by every single prince, including, for instance, it was the same instrument by which, for instance, states like Bhavalpur, and there were 2 or 3 states in Balochistan, in the frontier, who joined Pakistan on the basis of the same instrument of accession. Now, the difficulties emerged, of course, with the tiny state called Junagadh in Kathiawar, where the Nawab decided to join Pakistan. But most inhabitants of Junagadh were not only Hindu, but there was a very solid sort of Congress organization, as was the case in most of Gujarat at the time. And so there was a siege, there was a rebel government set up. The Nawab of Junagadh finally fled to Karachi, and Indian troops basically moved in, and Junagadh was absorbed into the Indian Union. But very interestingly, soon following this, there was a plebiscite held in Junagadh, where some 90% of the people voted to join India. This was not surprising because, as I said, some 90% of the people were Hindu anyway. Okay, the 2 really complicated cases were Hyderabad and Kashmir. In the case of Hyderabad, the Nizam held out for a very long time, and as all of you know, again, a significant part, something like 80 or 85% of the people of Hyderabad state at the time was Hindu, but the Muslim population, the elite, the ruling elite, was certainly very largely Muslim, and it also had very strong Muslim organizations, political organizations, especially in the city of Hyderabad, and some district towns of what used to be Hyderabad at the time, now some are part of Karnataka, some are part of Aurangabad and so on, which is part of Maharashtra now. But anyway, the Nizam held out for a long time, not wanting to join, and he demanded that he be allowed to stay independent. Kashmir, as you know, once again, is a situation where the ruler was Hindu, but the population was very largely Muslim. And an interesting problem emerges here, because this is where Hafsa was referring to the so-called complications of Kashmir. There was a complication. You see, it is quite obvious now that had there been a large political unanimity or consensus among the Muslim population of Kashmir to join Pakistan, that is what would have happened. There was no possibility, because that is exactly what was expected. In fact, there is ample evidence, even among political leadership in Delhi, that this was the anticipated outcome, that Hyderabad would join India and Kashmir would join Pakistan. The difficulty in the case of Kashmir was a very organized, popular movement in the valley, which was strongly anti-monarchical, which was very much in favor of abolishing feudal property and in favor of land redistribution. And this was led initially by what was called the Muslim Conference, led by Sheikh Abdullah, which changed to the National Conference, I think in 1937, if I'm not mistaken. When it decided to admit non-Muslims as members, and there were several important Hindu political leaders in the leadership of the National Conference at the time. Some years later, once the Muslim League demand with the Pakistan resolution, the early 40s, I think 41, one group broke away from the National Conference and revived the Muslim Conference. I think the leader was called Ghulam Abbas, is that correct? Yes. Yeah. So that broke away. And so that had its own independent following. And this was the complication. The complication was that even geographically, for instance, the northern areas, Mirpur, Baltistan, Gilgit, and so on, were very strongly in favor, where the Muslim League itself, through the Muslim Conference, was very influential. And in 1947, this population was clearly in favor of joining Pakistan. Whereas in the valley itself, Sheikh Abdullah's National Conference, which was strongly allied with the States People's Congress, which was the Congress organization, did not want to join Pakistan. And so this becomes the political problem where the Maharaja didn't know what to do. He was holding out until, of course, there was the so-called raids from the frontier region. The Maharaja sends this emergency call to Delhi. VP Menon rushes to Srinagar, gets the accession signed, comes back, and Indian troops begin to go. One very interesting thing about this moment, again, this is a part of the story that's largely forgotten. What were the Indian and Pakistani armies at this point of time? Both India and Pakistan, the army had one supreme commander, who was Auchinleck, Field Marshal Auchinleck, who was the commander of both armies, India and Pakistan. All the senior commanders of the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy of both armies, all 6 were British. Now, this is interesting because, in fact, as soon as the Indian troops were airlifted into Srinagar, this is well documented, Jinnah actually ordered the chief of the Pakistan army to move in to Kashmir. Glancy, if I'm not mistaken, General Glancy was the person who had to seek permission from Auchinleck and then to Auchinleck. Auchinleck flew to Karachi and explained to Jinnah that because the Maharaja had signed the accession, Kashmir was now Indian territory, and if Pakistani troops moved in, it would count as a foreign invasion, in which case he would have to ask every single British officer in both armies to leave. Right? Jinnah withdrew the order. So that is what India and Pakistan armies at this point were. The two armies had really not yet been separated properly. So that is a position where, in fact, Mountbatten had enormous influence on this initial period because he was, above all, most concerned about the two armies getting into an open war. Some of you who've read the history would remember there was a famous, Mountbatten actually flies to Lahore to offer Jinnah a plan. And the plan is Kashmir and Hyderabad together, that let there be plebiscites in both places. Okay? Let the people of each of these places decide where they want to go to, because he said that according to the principle of the partition, right, it should be whichever is the majority religious group, that is the dominion to which that state should go. Except in this case, the ruler is of a different religion and was unwilling to do what the people were doing. Now, Jinnah did not accept this because he was willing to accept the plebiscite in Kashmir, but unwilling to accept plebiscite in Hyderabad, for obvious reasons, because the plebiscite in Hyderabad would certainly have gone in India's favor. Now, this is where Mountbatten leaves the scene. And then, of course, is immediately followed, and of course it's followed one day after Jinnah's death, that Indian troops move into Hyderabad. And Hyderabad is annexed, one would say, to India. There was no plebiscite in Hyderabad. There was a military governor put in place. And very interestingly, Patel, who was the Home Minister, was very clear on this, that Hyderabad has been taken by armed force. And so this is not the result of a political negotiation with the ruler, as with the other states. So Hyderabad, of course, later on, as we know, there was at this time a major communist insurgency in Hyderabad at this particular point of time. Anyway, let's not get into that. To come back to Kashmir, the interesting thing was, with the accession, Sheikh Abdullah was appointed as it was called the interim prime minister. A constituent assembly, the Maharaja calls a constituent assembly. The constituent assembly is formed and put into session. Now, this constituent assembly is a very interesting thing. It was not only Kashmir which was given a constituent assembly. There were several other states which also had constituent assemblies, right? This was the general formula, that these states would, it just so happened that only 4 states actually set up constituent assemblies. Saurashtra did, Travancore did, Mysore did, and Jammu and Kashmir did. These were the 4 states which actually set up constituent assemblies. In 1950, when the Indian Constitution, well, it starts from 1949, when the final form is being given to the Constitution, the question becomes what would happen to these states with their constituent assemblies. And since virtually nobody had been able to put up their constituent assemblies, it was decided that anything to do with these states would be included in the body of the Indian Constitution, which is why the initial Constitution, you don't see this anymore, initial Constitution had 4 grades of states, right? A, B, C, and D. And they were all ranked with different kinds of relationship to the center. And so all of these so-called former princely states were included as either B category or some of them into C category, mostly into B. So they had their own position defined in the body of the Constitution itself, except for these states which still had constituent assemblies and therefore could come up with their own constitutions. It's to accommodate these states that Articles 370 and 371 were put into place. 370 specifically for Jammu and Kashmir, and 371 initially was meant for Mysore and Travancore. Now, the interesting thing is 1951 and 1952, Travancore Constituent Assembly formally declares that they would accept. Saurashtra did this even earlier. They would formally accept the Indian Constitution, as did the Travancore Assembly, the Mysore Assembly in 1952. So that after 1952, until you come to the period when Assam, Nagaland, Maharashtra, all of those states are also brought into the picture as special provisions. There was 371 was really inoperative. It didn't relate to anything else, except for Jammu and Kashmir, which, of course, went through with its constitution in 1956. The constitution was promulgated. The Constituent Assembly was dissolved. Right? This is all under. By this time, of course, Abdullah had been removed from power and arrested. This is under Bakshi Ghulam Ahmad. This was a completely stooge government. But then that is where the situation remained from then onwards. As Hafsa has said completely correctly, this provision of the Article 370 was hollowed out over the years, from the very 1950s, hollowed out over the years through presidential proclamations, formally speaking, but a lot of them with the concurrence of the state legislature, so that one central law after another became applicable, so that in the end it is really quite correct to say that apart from that formal structure of the state having its own constitution, a very large part of central governments did, in fact, apply to Jammu and Kashmir. So this is the overall situation. So it's important to remember why 370 was there in the first place, and 371 has everything to do. 370 has everything to do with 371 as well. Now, to come back to where we started from, what is the overall significance? Now, if one looks at this from some position, outside the framework of Indian democracy and so on, it is completely correct. I have absolutely nothing to quarrel with Hafsa's description account of this position. If you look at it from the position of a Kashmiri, someone who speaks on behalf of a Kashmiri people and the aspirations of a Kashmiri people, what she says is I have no quarrels with it. From within the framework of Indian democracy, however, right, for those who actually live within and have to engage in debates within Indian democracy, the kinds of debates that are possible, you cannot begin from that position, because of course that is not a position that's, not only is it not shared by anybody, nobody is going to listen to you. If one were to say this, if I were to say this, I would probably not even be published in any significant Indian news outlet. It is simply not possible. So it is really from within the federal framework. What could a federal framework mean? That is where from at least for someone like me, who lives and works within the space of the Indian sort of public political domain. That is the space from within you have to open this question. What about the people of Kashmir? What about their wishes? How do you open up a political space where the people of Kashmir will be given priority over all of these other questions? In each case, for instance, right today, if you were to ask otherwise fairly reasonable thinking people in India, who would say, why did we need this Article 370? I mean, it's from all that they're concerned, it's well and good that it's done away with. If this means that the people of Kashmir be kept under a lockdown for the next 6 months or 6 years, well and good. If that's what we need, that is what we need. The whole thing has become one where it's a question of Kashmir being a kind of piece of real estate which India owns and which is somehow being threatened by, the identification is very clear, it's Pakistan. And we have to defend Kashmiri territory against Pakistani designs. That, it was said yesterday in almost as many words, because if I'm not mistaken, I didn't listen to this, I just read the summary of this in a newspaper this morning. The argument was that anyone who challenges what was done on August 4 is speaking on behalf of terrorists. That was the exact framework. So that is what we have at the moment. I think I've taken too much of the time, and